Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. John, one of my favorite N.T. Wright quotes is when he says, whenever Paul went anywhere, there was either a revival or a riot. And wherever I go anywhere, they just serve tea. And we left Paul on what very much looks like the edge of a riot. Yeah. And if he turns this out round into revival, that really will be a miracle.
Absolutely. I do encourage NT Wright. Hopefully they're not poisoning the tea. You know, yes. As long as the tea is good. But if they stick a bit of poison in the tea, that would be worse. But yes, I love that. I love that, absolutely. And the controversy is continuing to follow Paul. My goodness, we saw him last time. Well, if the Romans hadn't have intervened, Paul would have definitely been killed, I think, on the spot. You know, we've reflected before when he was stoned previously, you know, did he die? Was he raised? There's a lovely conversation around that, but I think he wouldn't have survived a very, very zealous mob. Defending the temple. What one thing to be stoned in a Gentile city, but another thing to face the wrath of a mob within the confines of the religious setting and the temple. So it's a different level entirely. And again, I sort of, for me, there was a little echo on Stephen. You know, thinking about how Stephen was rushed upon, and ironically, Saul himself was sort of part of that terrible execution, even though he didn't pick a stone up to do it. He was definitely part of the conspiracy against Stephen. And that sort of religious zeal that took Stephen out would have definitely taken Paul out had the Romans not intervened.
Well, I mean, you reflected on it in the last episode, the text, they were trying to kill him, you know. And then even when the Romans get involved, the crowd then switch to say the same things that the crowd said to the Romans about Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, take him away. More than likely actually crucify him is what that
the implication
is intended to be understood as. I think that one of the things the NIV does of chapter 21 and verse 36 is the crowd shouted, "Get rid of him." And the literal Greek is "take him away, lift him up," you know. I think it's important that although I criticize the translation "get rid of him" because it disconnects us from the fact it's the same thing the crowd say about Jesus. One of the things that makes sense is when they say "take him away," they don't mean would you move him over there? They mean like take him out, as in kill him. So they couldn't kill him. They're now asking the Romans to kill him, and that draws us into like today's conversation, where the crowd, Paul is being carried out by the soldier. That's the level of
unceremoniously. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's no dignity in this moment, is there, for Paul?
Yes, no, absolutely. So I think we're going to read just the sort of first few verses of, the last few verses of chapter 21, first couple of verses of 22. So they're just set, there's a subtle scene change, isn't there? We seem to have gone from like a riotous mob screaming to now we get a bit of a conversation between Paul and the commander, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll read from verse 37, chapter 21, down to the beginning of chapter 22. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists or assassins out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet.
Yeah. The fascinating little nuances of story here. Almost every sentence offers something to ponder, doesn't it? We have, we see Paul's ability to communicate across different spheres. Yep. So he's speaking Greek to the soldier. The soldier, it reacts to that. He speaks in Aramaic to the crowd, and the crowd react to that. Like, we're seeing the diversity of Paul. He really is able to be the apostle to the Gentiles in so many ways. His ability to communicate, his ability to navigate spaces. At some level, Paul becomes the archetypal person of the Spirit, because he's able to occupy all of these different spaces so well, isn't he?
Completely. And what mustn't be lost here is that they've just tried to kill him. So I don't know if our listeners have ever been in a violent situation or felt a sense of threat, or, having grown up in Belfast during what was labelled the Troubles. I was in a number of situations where I felt either my life was directly under threat or collectively a sense of threat. Yes. I remember on a number of occasions having to run for my life from people who, had they caught me, may have maybe not taken my life, but certainly have left me broken and bruised. And, situations like that, adrenaline rush, confusion, anger, anxiety, you react. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And Paul's level of composure here.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
I mean, it's like, seriously, it's just stunning. So somehow by the time they get to where they're about to go into the barracks, carrying Paul up the steps, getting him out of reach of the mob. So probably then they're able to put him down so he can start to walk up the steps out of the reach of that mob. But is it, I mean, he must have been disheveled. He's probably got blood on him. He'd certainly be bruised. This is a mob that has been trying to kill him before the Romans got to him. Paul, he's been manhandled, and he would not have been manhandled gently by the Romans. They think he's an assassin who's led a revolt. So they're not going to be gentle with him. This man has been brutalized for the last, we don't know exactly how long, but it wouldn't have been a quick event, and he's been brutalized. And his measure of composure here is absolutely, his presence of mind to speak to the Roman in Greek. Now, of course, like, Paul's at least bilingual, maybe trilingual, maybe other stuff going on. The fact that Paul's lived in the Gentile world and grown up in a Gentile world, he's well used to moving from one language to another. But the fact that he so seamlessly moves, he doesn't assume that the Roman can speak Aramaic, which he may well have been able to do, but he speaks to the Roman in Greek because that's the common language. Roman could speak Latin, but he definitely speaks to him in Greek because that'll be absolutely certain that we can communicate together. It's a measure of composure which is truly stunning in the midst of this. And again, it's something we shouldn't rush past. I think this is a man who's just been used to these types of terrible situations. We know that when we get into letters that he writes to Corinth, that we know he's been beaten a number of times. We know eventually he's shipwrecked. We know that he's been stoned. We know that he's been lashed. But Paul already has some serious scars on him, and his ability to settle himself, speak to the Roman with respect, and speak to the crowd with a measure of profound control. I mean, it's just, I think it's quite breathtaking. And I think the Aramaic Greek thing, I think it just leans into all of that. I think here's a man who can just flip between languages after having just been beaten within an inch of his life.
There's a fascinating, like, that level of Paul's presence is in contrast to everybody else not knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think it's just so stark. The crowd are there under a false pretense. They think he brought Trophimus into the temple and he didn't. Right? The Roman thinks he's some Egyptian terrorist that he's picked up on. And this story reminds me, John, and I think there's a lesson for us in this, that of we, the people of God, when we lose our minds over stuff, and start to attack each other, it does our defense of the work of God no good. Right, the law does not look better in this situation as the mob tried to kill Paul, and the gospel doesn't look better in this situation as the Romans are kind of bashing their way in. It reminded me of I don't know why it reminds me of this when you were reading it, but it's going to be, my goodness, 12, 14 years ago, right? And let me say this, I'm not making any sort of weight of where I stand on this argument, but I remember the Christian writer at the time, Rob Bell, wrote a book, and some other, there was another Christian writer, John Piper, did not like some of the things that Rob Bell said in that book. So went on to Twitter and posted a very short comment, essentially alluding to the fact that he didn't think Rob Bell was part of the faith anymore. Christians, I mean, this was the big story in Christendom, if you remember at the time. Everybody, we were both lecturing at the time. Every student wanted to ask you a question on where this stands and all that. However, Rob Bell on Twitter, because of the way Twitter develops, is often just people that are good at computers that get onto it first. Rob Bell on Twitter was actually an IT technician in the south of England, right? And so this IT technician in the south of England wakes up one day, and I remember he posted something along the lines of, "Why are all the Christians angry at me?" Right? Because he woke up in the morning and there is thousands and thousands of people saying that he's a heretic or saying that he's the best thing ever. And this poor man, who has no background in the church, is like, what is happening here?
Yes.
Why is everybody angry? Now, again, for some people, you may even remember that argument, and like all of these arguments, it died down over time. But for some reason, when you were reading the story, this reminded me of that this Roman governor is being brought into something, and he hasn't the first clue what's going on, right?
No.
He has no idea of the things that are at play here. And I was thinking about how, like, we, the church, we do this all the time. We get so angry at each other about things that we throw things up into riot. And the rest of the world, if they do get brought into it, are just like, what are these people even on about? Why are they doing that? But I think Luke intends us to see this chaos, that this man, like, he cannot, even though he's the emperor's representative, he cannot judge this situation well, because he's surprised that Paul even speaks Greek. He thought he just arrested an Egyptian terrorist. And that level of Paul's composure, right? Which is fascinating to me, because when we actually listen to Paul's speech, he makes up. I mean, listen to this. We didn't read it, but we just jump ahead. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death. So Paul has the composure to actually put himself in the place of the riotous crowd and be like, I get what you're going through. But the person that's tasked sounds like Pilate. Like when Pilate's with Jesus going, I don't even really know what's going on here. I think so often this is the challenge that we face, that we blow things up and clarity is lost. The church then doesn't look good in the face of the world. And actually, we don't end up settling the actual debate well. And it takes, to your point, it takes Paul to have the composure to actually be able to see things from the perspective of the riotous crowd. I know, the whole thing makes me both laugh, cry, and be in amazement all at the same time.
Yeah. And I think it's there's a lovely lesson to as we think about some of the very divisive and controversial issues of the 21st century, that actually what sometimes the church needs is a simple, composed and calm response to what is right and true. So it's interesting that Paul doesn't respond to the accusation directly. Like if you'd have said to me, "Oh, you're that Egyptian terrorist," I'd have said, "I'm not a terrorist. I'm not even Egyptian." Now, Paul doesn't directly respond, but Paul says, amazing. "No, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city." There's even in the way he responds to the Roman, it's not antagonistic. It's not defensive. He's responding out of security. He's responding out of truth. He's responding out of a sense of himself. And I think, of course, what's fascinating is he doesn't even say I'm a Jesus follower. In the context of the riotous situation, he describes himself as a Jew, because he wants maybe the Roman to understand, look, I understand what's going on here, even if you aren't quite sure what's going on here. I've got this, and you need to trust me. And again, can I just say this? And we're speaking a little bit from the edge of silence here, because tonation is hard to read in the text.
Yes.
But a Roman who's just rescued an Egyptian assassin from a mob in Jerusalem, and he will know what mobs in Jerusalem could have done, is prepared now to allow the Egyptian assassin, who turns out to be a Jewish citizen of Tarsus, to speak to the mob.
Yeah.
So, I mean, think about that. Just as a turnaround. I mean, if I'm the Roman soldier, I want to get this guy out of that situation as quickly as possible. I want him in the barracks, and I'm going to give him a good pummeling, and we're going to sort him out, and we're going to find out why on earth he's stirring up city in one of the most volatile cities on the planet as far as a Roman is concerned. And yet something in the way Paul responds to the Roman causes the Roman to go, when Paul says, "Can I speak to the people?" the Roman goes, "Yeah, that seems like a good idea to me." and you go, "What? Okay, well, you've just rescued him from probably certain death." So there's something in Paul here that's oozing confidence, security, calmness. And you know what, David? Like we're always careful about application to the 21st century because there's so many complexities that our listeners will be contending with. But my goodness, there are just moments when the church just needs to remain composed and calm and secure, and not get pulled in to the riotous arguments or the misinformation that's going on out there, and just say, "Oh no, this is who we are. This is where we're from. Oh, and by the way, we've still got something to say." And that ability to remain calm and composed, it's that. I remember millions of years ago, I watched the little movie Madagascar with our children, and the penguins would say, "Smile and wave, boys, smile and wave." And there's some moments where actually you've just got to smile and wave, keep your composure, don't panic, and let the truth speak. Paul, in the most spectacular way, is doing this. And I don't think that should be missed within the context here.
It's interesting as you were saying that as well. I mean, this is all happening in the temple. Paul was in the temple because he was down there as part of his purification rites. So I think Luke intends us to remember all of this and see the irony. I mean, Paul's head is shaved.
Yeah.
He's looking like a very devout, Jewish person.
Yeah.
He's being mobbed by a Jewish crowd, and the commander's like, "Are you that Egyptian?" Right? Like the whole thing, I think, is discombobulating, that nothing's happening as it's supposed to be happening. Nobody's looking or doing the things that you expect them to do. Paul looks like a Jew. He's accused of being an Egyptian. He's accused of starting a riot, but the commander's like, yeah, you can speak to the crowd, right? And then even the fact that, I mean, I'm curious, what you think of this, but he says to them in Aramaic.
Yeah.
And Luke seems to want us to see this. Because notice, when they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have some thoughts on this, but I'm curious, like, what do you think's going on there? Luke seems to want us to connect the silence and the Aramaic together, doesn't he?
He seems to, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, for me, there's this gorgeous sense of speaking to both brothers and fathers. I mean, that feels to me incredibly honorable and respectful. So again, there's a tone towards the crowd that is not antagonistic. Yeah. In fact, when we eventually get into the speech of Paul, I think he's incredibly sensitive to the Jewish context of his world, and he's very, very careful in the choice of his words to them. And this brothers and fathers. I mean, imagine standing on the steps and hearing, right, that this guy's sort of trashing our world, and yet when he speaks in Aramaic. I mean, some translations even suggest Hebrew, but ultimately he's speaking the language of the people.
Yes. And
again, there's a lovely little nuance in Jesus. I think every time you see Jesus speak to the people, he speaks in Aramaic. Probably when he's in scholarly debate, I think then they're probably talking Hebrew, reading Hebrew, discussing the Hebrew text. But to the common person, to the everyday person, he speaks in Aramaic in order to connect to them. So it could be a lovely little nuance there. And then this whole defense idea. He's literally presenting an apologetic, quite literally in the use of the word there. He's presenting an apologetic of his story of Jesus, of the gospel, but he does it in the language that they understand, in the language that the Lord spoke to him at his conversion.
I find myself wondering, and again, it's just from silence here, but in tracking with the theme that we are talking about, is there almost a level that the crowd have forgotten who Paul is already? Right? And that he starts speaking, and I'm curious about, I mean, again, I don't expect anyone to be able to answer this, but Luke has set us up with the surprise from the soldier that Paul speaks Greek.
Yeah.
So the soldier definitely doesn't know who Paul is, right? But the crowd, it almost feels like, and this is what I'm kind of trying to sense, it almost feels like Luke thinks they're surprised to hear him speaking Aramaic. Like, it's like, oh, he's one of us, right? Almost as if in this very short space of time, they've all forgotten that, right? They know he's a Jew. They're concerned with, and is Luke again adding to this commentary that once you get into sort of mob mentality, like everything gets lost, and they're almost now coming back and relearning, who Paul is. Or the other option I'd wondered is, has this crowd now grown that there's people literally just in the crowd out for someone's blood and they don't even know who it is, right? But it just struck me. I mean, I love what you've brought out as well. I mean, that's way deeper than I expected in that sense. But I love all of those notions of what you've said, and I just wonder if Luke is trying to just keep alerting us to, the danger of just ganging up on somebody, that they get lost in it somehow.
Yeah, and there seems to be a development of the silence. In verse 40, it almost reads like a great silence.
Yeah.
And then in verse 2 of 22, they became sort of even more quiet.
Yes.
So there's even a sort of a growingness in the silence, that something is impacting them. Now, again, we can't argue from silence, excuse the pun. Is there something of the work of the Spirit happening here? Where you're getting even what was a raucous, dynamic, it seemed out of control crowd quietening down, almost supernaturally, or now we can't argue that because there's no explicit reference to the Spirit moving here. But of course, we believe Paul is a man of anointing. We believe he's a man of the Spirit. Is there something supernatural going on here? But there is a growing silence. It goes from a great silence to they became even more quiet. Yes. So something really has impacted them in the way that Paul addresses them. And it could be, of course, as you've rightly said, remember, we're trying to visualize this. We're only getting the verbals.
Yeah.
They would have seen this man carried up the steps. They would have seen this man disheveled, bloodied, and then suddenly speak with profound composure in the language that they understand in the temple precinct, and speak, to begin with, in a profoundly respectful way, brothers and fathers.
Yes.
I mean, there's something really gorgeous and tender about that. And again, it does show us something of just, the character of the class of the character of Paul, that he refers to people who 2 minutes ago were trying to beat the life out of him as brothers and fathers. So I think all of that's in the mix, David. I think I would think, and I wouldn't build my house on it. We couldn't. I think there could be something even supernatural at work, as well as something profoundly psychological and emotional happening in this moment that creates the silence in the context of this moment.
Yeah. It's interesting, the language of brothers and fathers as well. Like, I was pondering whether does this tell us something of where Paul was when this riot started, right? So the accusation is he's taking Trophimus into the temple, although Luke seems to want us to think that he hasn't done that. But you've got the outer court of the Gentiles, you've got the court of Israel, you've then got the court of the men, right?
Yeah.
Is Paul, having just gone through, and so, again, like, work with me on this if you think I'm mistaken, but he's just gone through a purification vow, which would mean that all areas of the temple other than the priestly areas are now open to him. And he's going to, it seems, conclude his purification vow. So is it that he's actually in the court of the men? That's where the riot kicks off, right? And although other people have joined the riot, because people have come from everywhere to get involved, Luke's told us that, earlier on, in verse 30 of chapter 21. But I'm wondering if the brothers and fathers is because the people who have gathered this riot and are leading it are a group from inside the court of the men in the temple. It's unusual for Paul, to seem to know that there are no women there. In that sense. It's not
very good.
It's like, if it was just brothers, we would say, oh, it's this general Aramaic way of speaking, which is almost like brethren, right? Just family, right? But it seems to be specific that he's identifying, brothers. Yeah. So I just pondered whether are we seeing a little bit of almost eyewitness account from Luke here that that tells us where this riot started. Do you think I'm pushing that too much?
No, I think that could be there. And certainly it would then make sense to the way Paul is able to conduct his speech almost, he's not interrupted at all the way through this speech. He gets to the end of the speech, and it's not until he drops the sort of the Gentile line at the end of the speech that the mob kicks off again. So whoever is listening to him now, they're listening to him relatively respectfully, which again is remarkable considering what's just happened. So there's a lot of paradox within this whole experience, and again, it shows you that we sort of leaned into this a little bit right at the end of our last podcast. The Lord providentially bringing something good out of something that is bad, and you and I would have looked at a mob that was trying to kill a man and thought, there's no reasoning with that mob. There's no way they're going to listen to anybody, and yet somehow, supernaturally or naturally, this mob now settles this group of fathers and brothers, forgive me the language of mob, but the fathers and brothers settled to such an extent that Paul is able to speak to them. And it is a remarkable, not only have we seen remarkable composure in Paul, but we're now seeing a crowd turn to some degree and start to listen to this man and what he has to say. And again, it's to encourage our own hearts that sometimes we look at a world that seems to be completely deaf to anything the voice of Jesus might want to say. At least that's our perception sometimes, that people don't want to listen, although I'm not convinced of that, of course, but people don't want to listen. And yet sometimes in the most incredible moments, the Holy Spirit can turn a moment where they start to listen and they open up their hearts and they open up their minds and start to hear what has to be said. However they ultimately react to that and what they do with that, they are nonetheless listening. And he appeals for them to listen. Listen now to my defense. Let me explain to you who I am and where I'm from and why I'm here. And remarkably, just like the Roman soldier remarkably allows Paul to speak, the crowd of brothers and fathers and whoever else is in the crowd remarkably let him speak.
Yeah.
So there is this, like sometimes we live in a world where we say no for the crowd. We just assume that nobody's going to listen, that person won't listen to me. And actually then because we think they won't listen, we don't appeal to them to listen. Here's Paul standing before a group of people that you would have put your mortgage on it. They would not want to listen to anything this man has to say. And yet when he asks them to listen, they do. And maybe that's an encouragement for all of us in the world in which we live, with so many voices, so many different opinions, that sometimes we think nobody wants to listen to the voice of Jesus. But maybe if we appeal to people, that actually the Holy Spirit can create moments where they will listen and they will hear.
And maybe the pondering sometimes is to ponder, how are we saying the things of Jesus? You know, Paul, to your point, is very calm here. He's not screaming at people. He's not ramming it down their throats. You know, he's asked, can I speak to the people? Right? You know, please now, brothers and fathers, listen to my defense. Right? There's a calmness to him, isn't there? That is quite wonderful. And this, of course, then takes Paul into one of the repetitions of his own testimony. And you and I have got a few weeks to chat through now how we approach this, so your listeners can hold on and find out. But Paul, what's interesting about this, let's say this just as we kind of leave this episode, at 3 occasions Paul's testimony is told in Acts, isn't it? And what's interesting, actually, is in the first occasion, Paul's story is told and we hear it. In this occasion, he is speaking in Aramaic and he tells his story. And then later in chapter 26, he'll tell his story again, but it appears in his later story he's telling it in Greek because he makes the point that when the Lord speaks, he hears it in Aramaic, which is kind of neat that Luke is drawing us to this Aramaic thing from time to time. But the story, interestingly, holds quite consistently in each of its retellings. So the challenge for us in a podcast like this is the story. We've said a lot about what we think about Paul's testimony in other episodes. Luke clearly wants the reader to not forget this. So we were pondering whether maybe the advice is, if you really want a reminder of Paul's testimony, go back to episode 34, which is nearly 2 years ago now. and there's a few episodes from 34 onwards where we ponder Paul's testimony. That might be a good thing to listen to, right?
Yeah. And also, you know, it's a beautiful thing, as you were sharing, reminding all of us of the 3 moments of Paul telling his story. It's a little reminder to us all, the power of our story. You know, I sometimes say to people, every human has a story, but only some of us have a Jesus story. And I think what Paul is not afraid to do on at least, you know, 2 occasions dynamically in terms of his testimony, and then one as it's told in the story,
Yeah.
He's not afraid to rehearse what Jesus has done for him. And I just find that wonderfully remarkable that we have an opportunity as we move into 2025 to be a people who confidently and calmly and with some sense of boldness and purpose tell our Jesus story so that the world hears the story of lives transformed and changed by him.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now, so until next time, from John and I, goodbye.